Backstories have taken over anime. Structurally, they serve as the backbone of shonen titles. Development-wise, they enhance characters, allowing single or double-core shows the opportunity to breathe. Backstories have a transformative effect on a narrative, usually by deepening our understanding of and empathy for characters, but can also further explore world-building, raise tension, and at times recontextualize everything we thought we knew about a story. For all the good a backstory can do, it can be tempting for an author to overuse the tool. Here, backstories may feel like an attempt to boost a boring character, or maybe it occurs just in time to kill a story's momentum. I feel like over the last handful of years, I've come across more of the overused kind of backstories, which is a real shame, because when a backstory is used properly, it has the chance to become the literal best part of a show. Genre-defining backstories are what I'm most interested in, so join me in trying to understand what makes the greatest anime backstories work. Welcome to AniEssays. Here we overanalyze anime and manga, with each video on the channel created under the belief that anime, same as film and literature, is worthy of in-depth criticism. If you enjoy my videos and want to support the channel, the best way to do that is by joining my Patreon. More information about Patreon benefits at the end of this video. For completionist's sake, what is the definition of a backstory? Backstories are an overview of a character's history, used to deepen and round the edges on characters' personalities, while adding to the world building and plot. Most backstories have direct references or influence with the current narrative, explaining why a character may be going after a specific goal or internal reasons for their decision-making. Backstories deal with a character's ghosts, the reason for how they act in the story's current narrative. Backstories are conveyed in three main ways. The first is the slow reveal of information. This is typically done through dialogue and discussions, where characters talk about background information in the natural flow of the current timeline. Then you have flashbacks, where a backstory is dramatized, usually through a memory, to put the audience in the character's past. And the final is through a prologue. At the start or very early in the story, you show a character's backstory, but here it's used as a jumping off point for the narrative at large. Now that we know what the textbook definition of a backstory is, what is far more important is how a backstory makes you feel. Backstories have a warping effect, sometimes making me fall in love with a character I previously despised, and others allowing me to see the bigger picture of a story, appreciating the repetition or sameness of events. Backstories open up the emotional side of characters, and when done properly, help to keep the pacing of the narrative moving forward. Backstories are often smaller, more focused versions of the larger narrative, sub-stories with tons of emotion and no fluff. Audiences have become so familiar with backstories that authors can't cut corners. The death of a parent just doesn't hit the mark when you've seen it in every show you've ever watched, so authors need to ensure backstories go beyond a sad event. Our sophistication towards character backstories doesn't just stem from anime, but all mediums. Of course, like anime, movies, TV shows, and literature are chock full of backstories. I do want to touch on how backstories function outside of animation a bit, but of course there will be so many great and interesting backstories that I'm not able to touch on. For film, choosing to do a backstory comes with a cost. Two of film's greatest strengths are the actors' performances and the recreation of time. When a filmmaker chooses to cut away from the present timeline, you lose the chance to have an actor reveal information from their past through performance.
I see the worst in people, Henry. I don't need to look past seeing them to get all I need.
Instead of interpreting the past on an actor's face and words, we passively experience it ourselves through a recreation of it. These flashbacks often make the past objective. The cost of losing performance and subjectivity does not exist in the same way in anime, as animation requires a larger suspension of disbelief that removes things like actors' performances right from the start. That means that animation has the ability to whip the narrative around more frequently and not have it break the realism that film has to contend with. Literature blurs the line even more. If you're living in the mind of a character, you need to get clever about when you reveal certain elements elements of a backstory. This is where framing devices and point of view can be so much fun for authors to manipulate. Animation sits somewhere in the middle. Inner character thoughts are more accessible here than in live action, and the recreation of time goes further in animation than a novel ever could. One of my favorite backstories in anime has to be Odenashi from Angel Beats. Angel Beats is set at a high school in the afterlife. The characters here exist in a type of purgatory, where they must come to terms with the trauma they experienced in their lives before they can leave this high school. In the midway point of the 13-episode show, Odenashi remembers how he died, and we are taken through his final moments. The entire show is structured around dealing with their past, and so the halfway mark is the perfect time to introduce us to what actually happened in Odenashi's previous life. It is the perfect use of a flashback that is a fundamental part of the story's ideas and structures. You can't remove this backstory from the narrative and have it function in the same way. Odenashi's fundamental backstory reminds me a bit of my favorite backstory in film, Vito Corleone from Godfather Part 2. In The Godfather Part 1, we see Vito start as the cold mob leader and slowly turn into an aged father who wants to put an end to bloodshed. The first movie contrasted this with Vito's son Michael, who begins the film outside of the crime family and ends up being baptized as the new head of the family in Vito's place. The second film takes that contrast even further. The story is framed with Vito's past, dramatizing his ascent in the New York crime scene, and it mirrors Michael in the present day as his family starts to fall apart. This backstory's impact stems from the backstory itself being its own narrative. It isn't fluff for the story, but the core of every idea in The Godfather Part 2, while also reinforcing and changing the dynamics of how we understand Part 1. It deepens the sadness we feel for Michael as he fails to understand the purpose of how and why Vito did business, and it betrays the dream his father had of Michael getting the chance to live a life outside of crime. While there is no direct equivalent to a backstory that iconic in anime, I think Kakashi's backstory in the middle of Naruto's story has a similar effect. In the manga's transition between Naruto and Naruto Shippuden, Kishimoto takes us through Kakashi's backstory. While Kakashi isn't a one-for-one reflection like Vito and his son Michael, his past has qualities in how Team 7, his team, ends up splitting ways. Just like how Naruto loses Sasuke, Kakashi lost Obito. This backstory fulfills all three functions that every backstory should. We get major lore reveals by spending time with the fourth Hokage. Kakashi transforms from the cool teacher to a deeply empathetic character whose past allows him to help his students even more, and the flashback comes at the perfect time in the narrative as the story moves into the more mature and focused second half. Naruto often gets criticized for its overuse of backstories, but with Kakashi, Kishimoto nailed what makes flashback sequences compelling. Backstories that define the narrative structure always has the chance to be the best. To give an example of a modern fantasy literature series, few create backstories quite like Brandon Sanderson in the Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive is the defining modern fantasy story. One of Sanderson's greatest strengths as a writer is how he structures his novels. In the Stormlight Archive, each monstrous 1,000-page plus book is bound by the backstory of one of the main characters. The Way of Kings, the story's first book, reveals the backstory of Kaladin. Kaladin starts the story as a slave. In the current narrative, Kaladin is thrust into a war where he must carry a bridge into battle for the real soldiers to use. This job has the highest likelihood of death. In the backstory, we slowly learn how Kaladin came to be in this situation. As the main narrative progresses, so does that backstory, and it adds depth to the world, but most importantly, its climaxes mirror those within the narrative. So when we get to the biggest reveals about what happened in Kaladin's past to put him in this situation, it happens to be in the middle of the biggest action sequence in the book. This results in Sanderson's famous Sanderlanches at the end of his novels, where the final 200 pages or so feel like you're on a roller coaster. Here, the backstory is an essential element to Stormlight's narrative, and it reaches its apex in the third book with Dalinar Kholon's backstory, which reveals a hidden darkness in one of the story's seemingly most honorable characters. Mystery is key for these backstories due to their length. That becomes clear in Stormlight's fourth novel, Rhythm of War, War, where the backstory fell a little short on previously set standards due to the lack of intrigue in the past's timeline. The backstory chapters in Stormlight are always some of the best, but Sanderson also starts off each novel with a separate backstory chapter, here revealing a new point of view on the killing of a king that sets the entire plot of the story in motion. This backstory is the prologue for each novel. When it comes to prologues, my mind immediately goes to Berserk's Golden Age arc. The Golden Age arc could easily be considered the greatest backstory in all of anime. While it does border on narrative reset, I do think it still classifies itself as a backstory. After the first major arc of Berserk's story, Miura pivoted the narrative to follow Guts from the unfortunate circumstances around his birth through his journey with the Band of Hawk. This backstory takes up a huge percentage of the story's runtime and is widely regarded as Berserk's best stretch of story. The Golden Age arc not only satisfies, but it is the standard for what a backstory can achieve. Its timing actually saves the narrative, whipping you from what feels like a mediocre fantasy tale into an inexplicably harrowing journey of anime's most tortured protagonist. The beginning of the Golden Age arc is unrelenting in its darkness, giving all views into how Guts could end up the way he does in the current timeline. What is so brilliant about the Golden Age arc, in similar fashion to how backstories in Stormlight function, is how Griffith, Casca, and the Band of Hawk pulls him out of that darkness. The backstory creates immediate empathy for Guts, and then makes you fall in love with everyone around him, to the point where you almost forget about the tone in the current timeline of the story. As most anime fans know, the eclipse at the end of the Golden Age arc is one of the most devastating stretches of story ever. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from the Golden Age arc. Time is a big one, as it allows the narrative of the past to come to life and give you a full-ranging experience. Because of its length, it also adds so much depth to the world and foreshadows major events to come. Most importantly, it gives us clear context on tons of important characters, protagonists, and antagonists alike. But you don't need to make your backstory take that long to have an impact. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood makes do with a single episode. Fullmetal's second episode explores why Edward has a mechanical arm and Al's body is a suit of armor. This backstory could have just been Ed and Al lose their parents, but it turns a sad situation into an active one. Yes, the boys lost their mother shortly after their father abandoned them, but the rest of the backstory shows how they try and fail to take the situation into their own hands. They find a teacher, attempt to bring their mother back to life, and find a second purpose after Mustang opens up the door to the military. This backstory is expanded on in the original adaptation and in the manga, but no matter which version you watch, their backstory adds a three-dimensional view into the characters and story. In only an episode, the audience can easily empathize with our heroes, see their flaws, and are now ready to jump into the main plot. It also adds a lot to the world building by showing the absolute limit of alchemy. While the prologue-style backstories early in a narrative can be perfect explanation for a character's purpose, while giving clear world-building expectations, the other style of backstory comes later, when expectations of characters are clear, then it flips everything on its head. A great example of recontextualized backstory has to be Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul. Kaneki has an ever-changing relationship with the past. Early on in the story, we learn that Kaneki lost his father at the age of 4, and later his mother at 10. His father was an avid reader, so to feel close to him, Kaneki started to read a lot. His mother ended up passing away from overwork after Kaneki's aunt started asking for money. Kaneki's backstory is brief and clues us into why he reads and plays a part in his loneliness, serving a familiar but lesser role to the Elrics in Fullmetal Alchemist. Sui Ishida complicates this initial backstory later by revealing some of Kaneki's repressed memories. Early in the story, Kaneki believed his mother to be kind, and she served as an example to him of how he should act. Later, he remembers that his mother turned abusive before her death. This revelation comes at a time Kaneki must take a major leap in his development, and it totally redefines everything we think about him and the themes of the story. And the blurring of identity that is seen in this backstory will go on to be a major theme of Tokyo Ghoul Re. These types of backstories do run the risk at killing momentum or serving as emotional bait for the audience. Backstories can be used as a crutch, especially in the form of a flashback. Say you haven't made your villain as interesting as you would like, but you want to still create empathy within them, then all you do is cut to a sad backstory and try to boost the villain up at the end of a fight. I think you can make the argument that this is the case with shows like Demon Slayer and Akame ga Kill. These action-focused series go through a litany of minor villains, almost all of them getting a sad backstory right before or after their death. Once you see this pattern a couple of times, it starts to grate on a viewer. Most of the time, they offer up one piece of new information, that a bad thing happened to a character in the past, resulting in them turning into a demon when they didn't want to be. In the end, this type of backstory feels hollow in terms of character work, as it doesn't offer up any new emotions beyond quick empathy, made worse when it takes away from an action scene's climax. The easiest way to see if a backstory doesn't feel necessary is to think about how the narrative would work if it wasn't shown. If the only change is you know slightly less about where a minor character came from, then the author didn't do a good enough job at making the backstory essential to the narrative. And while Demon Slayer and Akame ga Kill are just two examples of that, you can see it in a lot of the biggest stories in anime. This does bring me to the final boss of anime backstories, Ichiro Oda and One Piece. One Piece is unlike any other story I have ever experienced for many reasons. One of them is how consistently Oda uses backstories and how they almost always hit. He uses them for basic background information on a character like is done with all of the Straw Hats, adding clear logic to who a character is now, but those backstories are usually accompanied with tons of world-building elements that either connect to previous story beats or foreshadow future ones. One Piece is a story all about world-building with one of the largest casts I've ever come across. Seeing a character's past and how their pasts intersected with non-main characters is how Oda has added unmatched depth to One Piece's world. Oda employs every kind of backstory you could ever imagine, but I want to talk about two specifically: Oden and Sanji. Oden's backstory defined much of Wano as an arc. Oda uses Oden as the literal ghost of Wano and takes a large detour from the story to take us through his life. Oden becoming a fan favorite for his personality and growth from delinquent to martyr. Oden himself goes through a hero's journey which echoes many characters we see, but it is the added connection to the story's greatest legends, Goldie Roger and Whitebeard, that elevates this backstory to another status. Oden's backstory being something only achievable if you have decades worth of material to reference, and here Oda knocked it out of the park. Oden's backstory gives purpose to Wano, showing how a paradise could become a wasteland, adding weight to Momo and Kinemon's journey, introducing Laugh Tale, and showing why Kaido needs to be defeated. Oden's backstory captures Wano as an arc, functioning like the golden age for Berserk in its totality. If you remove Oden's backstory from Wano, then Wano would cease to exist. Sanji's backstory functions differently. Sanji's first backstory seems simple enough, offering up a reasonable explanation for his current situation, why he won't just leave to join the Straw Hats, and establishes his goal of finding the All Blue. The best aspect of this backstory is how it captures One Piece's tone, but it is like many of the story's beginning backstories that fail to equal what Oda would go on to achieve. Oda's development as a writer is on full display in Whole Cake Island when we get Sanji's second backstory. Here we learn that Sanji actually comes from a family of major players in the North Blue. Sanji's siblings are all genetically modified and far stronger than he is. It gives context to the politics of Another Sea and deepens our understanding of Sanji's heroism while forcing his character to develop and take a completely new direction than what we thought. Backstories are never a crutch much for Oda, but allows him to connect every inch of anime's largest world. The backstories in One Piece never get tiring because it always adds more to the world, themes, and character relationships. Oda far and away using backstories the best, to the point where I could make multiple videos just focusing on how he uses them and continues to push the limits of what a backstory can achieve. Anime is full of backstories, with many of them defining what makes the medium special. At times, the use of flashbacks can feel like the author baiting emotions out of viewers. However, when used well, backstories become these little bursts of emotion for a story, fueling the larger pace of a narrative and often becoming the most experimental pieces of foundation to an anime's ideas. Backstories are a mainstay for anime, and when done properly, can be the most important element of a show. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support the channel, then consider joining my Patreon. Through Patreon, you get access to the channel's Discord server, where we talk all things anime, manga, and media based, as well as having monthly anime watch-along discussions. You can also get your name at the end of every video and access to my Patreon exclusive channel updates. Thanks again for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.